The rivalry between the Apache and Comanche stands as one of the most enduring and fierce conflicts in Native American history. As sworn adversaries, they engaged in what the Spanish in Mexico referred to as a War of Extermination. By the late 1500s, the Eastern Apache had established a significant presence in the southern Great Plains, which provided them with excellent buffalo hunting grounds and the opportunity to cultivate crops, effectively allowing them to enjoy the benefits of both hunting and agriculture. This semi-agrarian lifestyle enriched their diets while placing them adjacent to the most crucial food source in North America. Conversely, the Comanche found themselves marginalized, driven into less favorable territories by more dominant groups like the Apache, which fostered a culture characterized by aggression and a thirst for vengeance. However, a pivotal change in the mid-1600s, instigated by their greatest adversary, would propel them to become the most formidable native group in American history. The Spanish, buoyed by their successes in Mexico during the 1500s, harbored ambitions of further conquest, leading them to gradually expand northward and colonize Apache lands. By around 1600, they entered the territory of present-day New Mexico, equipped with metal armor, firearms, and numerous horses, swiftly subjugating many native groups in the area. They imposed Christianity upon these groups and compelled them to labor for their benefit, mirroring their actions in Central and South America over the preceding century. However, the Apache were less compliant, launching violent raids against the newly established Spanish settlements and seizing horses in the process. Observing the Spanish from afar, they acquired the skill of horseback riding. By the 1650s, the Apache were executing mounted raids with increased efficiency. The horses' speed rendered them even more formidable. The relentless assaults became unbearable for the Spanish settlers in the area, with towns such as Taos and Santa Fe frequently targeted. The Pueblo Indians, who had been subjugated by the Spanish, suffered greatly from Apache aggression. As subjects of Spain, the Pueblo anticipated protection, yet the Spanish were unable to offer adequate defense. Although the raids were brief, their impact was devastating, as the Apache would eliminate any opposition and swiftly vanish into the western terrain with numerous horses and supplies. By 1680, the situation had escalated to the point where the Pueblo lost faith in Spanish protection and revolted, successfully expelling the Spanish from New Mexico, resulting in the escape of thousands of Spanish horses. Mustangs, resilient horses adapted to the Great Plains, began to migrate northward. Fast forward a few decades, despite the ongoing raids by the Apache, a notable shift occurred in 1706. The Spanish observed a sudden cessation of attacks against them, accompanied by inexplicable reports. The Apache appeared to be behaving unusually, with groups such as the Jay Guerrilla and the Mescaleros hastily abandoning their plains settlements and farms. Rumors of significant battles circulated, yet the Spanish remained unaware of the identity of the Apache's adversaries. They received reports of horse-mounted invaders from the north, described as powerful, swift, and perilous. By the 1720s, the Apache had suffered such severe losses that numerous bands retreated entirely into the mountains or sought protection from the Spanish. Some bands, however, did not reach that point. Spanish expeditions discovered that Apache groups residing on the plains, such as the Furones, Carlones, and Palomas, had completely disappeared, exterminated by an unidentified enemy. The source of this devastation was revealed by the Utes, who referred to the northern phantom invaders as the Comanche, meaning those who are always against me in their language. This term aptly described the people whom the Spanish would later name the Comanche. The Apache inadvertently contributed to their own downfall at the hands of the Comanche. Historically, the Comanche were often viewed as unimpressive, having been bullied by other tribes, including the Apache. They were forced to the eastern side of the Rockies, struggling to survive in the least favorable territories. However, in the mid-17th century, they experienced a transformative moment with the arrival of horses, which had been released due to Apache harassment of the Pueblo in Spanish territories. This event marked a significant turning point. The Mustangs, a breed well-suited for the plains, proliferated rapidly following the Spanish withdrawal from New Mexico, an event known as the Great Horse Dispersal. All regional tribes began to utilize horses, but the Comanche excelled in this regard. Their first strategic advantage was their commitment to breeding horses, Unlike other tribes that relied solely on raiding for their mounts, the Comanche bred their own horses, which served as a form of currency on the plains, making them quite affluent. In contrast, the Eastern Apache, like many other groups in the plains, engaged in at least semi-agricultural practices, which connected them to the land. The Comanche, however, did not engage in farming at all. As nomadic people, they roamed freely across the plains, and their horses enabled them to traverse distances that were previously deemed unattainable. If one found themselves within 400 miles of the Comanche, they were at risk. This vast range was invaluable for buffalo hunting, but it also rendered them formidable as warriors. Most of their raids occurred in the spring and summer when the grass was sufficiently tall to ensure ample food for their horses. They often conducted these raids under the cover of night, utilizing the full moon's light to navigate the plains, facilitating both their attacks and retreats. The raids were marked by extreme violence, including murders and tortures, so much so that settlers referred to these events as the Comanche Moon. Their most significant advantage, which set them apart from other tribes, was their ability to fight entirely mounted, a rarity among Native American tribes. George Catlin, an artist who observed the Comanche, noted their transformation upon mounting their horses, stating that while they appeared unattractive on foot, they became extraordinary horsemen once mounted. He expressed his admiration for their skill, particularly their ability to shoot arrows with precision while riding, often using their horses as shields by leaning off to the sides while shooting under the neck. In contrast, the Apache utilized horses primarily for travel and would dismount to engage in combat. On foot, they were equally fierce and brutal as the Comanche. If the Comanche could have been intercepted without their horses, they might have gained an advantage at times. The Comanche were deeply reliant on horses for their way of life. Locating them proved nearly impossible, as they never camped in the same location twice while on the warpath. In contrast, the Apache were more predictable due to their agricultural lifestyle, and their combat tactics were considered outdated. T.R. Fehrenbach aptly noted in his book, Comanches, A History of a People, that their preference for corn ultimately led to their downfall when their territory was invaded by ruthless, horse-mounted adversaries. The Comanche were particularly harsh towards the Apache, but their primary objective was not annihilation. Rather, they sought resources, especially the buffalo range. As previously mentioned, the Comanche harbored memories of their past weakness, which fueled their desire for vengeance and aggression against their foes. In Thomas Britton's book, Light Pan Apaches, it is stated that the Comanche's consistent goal was to catch the Apache by surprise at their rancherias, launching sudden assaults to kill as many as possible, abduct women and children for the New Mexico slave trade, and pillage the rancherias, destroying huts and crops. The prolonged conflict between these two formidable groups has largely faded from historical records, with even the Spanish observing from afar. However, it is evident that the violence was severe enough to turn all Comanche against all Apache. The documented outcomes narrate the tale, revealing that the Light Pan were among the last Apache on the plains, as the Mescaleros and Jaycarillas had retreated by the 1720s. In 1723, a significant event known as El Gran Sierra del Ferrero transpired, characterized by a prolonged assault by the Comanche on the Light Pan, resulting in numerous Light Pan casualties and the capture of many women and children. Similar to other tribes, the Light Pan were compelled to seek refuge in the mountains and deserts. They found themselves trapped as sculptors in the Spanish borderlands, facing a formidable force to the north in the Comanches and a sworn adversary to the south in the Spanish. For the Apache, it was imperative to devise a new strategy. In 1749, an unusual event occurred when the Apache entered San Antonio with the intention of negotiating a peace treaty with the Spanish. The Spanish were elated, as the Apache had been persistently raiding them since the city's establishment in 1719. These raids were not minor. They involved frequent kidnappings and murders, with the Apache absconding with thousands of horses and numerous supplies during that period. This situation posed a significant challenge, and the Spanish welcomed the Apache's overture for peace. The increase in raids had coincided with the Comanche expelling them from their lands, as the plains provided greater access to food and resources than the mountains and deserts they had been forced to inhabit. The Apache's request extended beyond peace. They also sought the establishment of a mission and presidio within their territory to facilitate their conversion to Christianity, a prospect they had previously been hesitant to embrace. The Spanish priests eagerly seized this opportunity. Although it took a few years for approval, this initiative would address multiple concerns for the Spanish. It could potentially end Apache raids permanently and allow for their conversion to Catholicism, thereby saving their souls. While there were whispers of gold and silver deposits in the region, it is likely that this was entirely coincidental to their decision. Sites for the mission were explored, and it was ultimately determined that the mission and presidio would be constructed at a site known as San Saba, with funding provided by a wealthy Spaniard. His only request for covering the expenses was that his brother, Father Alonso Geraldo de Toreros, manage the mission. A skilled and seasoned Spanish officer, Don Diego Ortiz de Perea, would supervise the endeavor. In April 1757, the Spanish assembled their provisions, a handful of priests, 100 soldiers, and approximately 2,000 animals for the undertaking. However, it was peculiar that the Apache were absent as they set out. Upon reaching San Saba, the Apache were still nowhere to be seen. Nevertheless, the mission and presidio were constructed about 2 miles apart, both secured by a substantial wooden palisade. Occasionally, the Apache would visit the mission, requesting gifts and assuring the Spanish of their imminent relocation. Yet after several months of inaction, the Spanish grew increasingly exasperated. Some priests suspected that the entire situation was merely a ruse, with the Apache solely interested in receiving gifts. This was indeed a deception, but not for the sake of gifts. In March, the Spanish uncovered the true motive behind the Apache's actions. San Saba was not within Apacheria, it was Comanche territory, and the Apache were attempting to instigate conflict. The Apache had been moving north to carry out raids against the Comanche, spreading rumors about the fort established in San Saba to incite further tension. Following their raids, they would leave behind items such as Spanish tools and shoes in Comanche camps, leading them to believe that the Spanish were allied with the Apache. By early March 1758, as spring grasses began to sprout and the bright full moon illuminated the plains, the Spanish observed that all Apache presence around San Saba had vanished entirely. As dawn broke, they began to hear war cries from beyond their fortifications. Over 60 of their horses had gone missing, and 15 soldiers dispatched for reconnaissance returned hastily, reporting that the hills were teeming with adversaries. As dawn broke, the sounds of war cries echoed from beyond their fortifications. More than 60 of their horses had vanished. 15 soldiers dispatched for reconnaissance returned hastily, asserting that the hills were teeming with adversaries. For nearly 2 weeks, the Comanche maintained their distance, while the presidio went into lockdown, with most refusing to venture beyond its walls. Father Toreros and approximately 30 others remained at the mission, situated 2 miles from the presidio. On March 16th, the Comanche arrived at the gates of both locations. As the Spanish peered over the palisade, they were filled with astonishment at the sight before them. Fehrenbach notes, quote, end quote. At the mission, the Comanche initially pretended to be friendly, and the priest permitted them entry. Accompanied by several other native tribes with whom the Spanish had previously established peaceful relations, the Comanche soon turned the situation deadly. Despite attempts to placate them with gifts, the encounter quickly escalated into a massacre. Reports vary, but it is estimated that the Comanche killed between 8 and 10 individuals at the mission, including Father Toreros, before setting fire to the buildings and desecrating the corpses. While looting the premises, some managed to escape to the more fortified presidio, likely because the Comanche prioritized plundering over pursuing fleeing missionaries who posed no threat. Perilla attempted to send reinforcements to the mission, but the soldiers he dispatched were swiftly attacked and forced to retreat. The Comanche never launched an assault on the presidio. They were astute, having gained the upper hand against the mission and made their statement. 2 days later, just as suddenly as they had arrived, they vanished. The immediate aftermath of the San Saba massacre proved to be even more dire for the Spanish. In the year 1759, a punitive expedition was dispatched with the intent of retaliating against the Comanche, led by Perilla. The mission, however, did not unfold as planned. The Spanish forces advanced northward, indiscriminately killing numerous Tonkawa simply because they were present. In October, they encountered the Comanche at the Red River, but the latter were well prepared. The Comanche ensured that any intrusion into their territory was anticipated, and they were elusive unless they chose to reveal themselves. Their numbers were significantly greater, with the Spanish fielding approximately 1,000 troops against at least double that of the Comanche. This disparity instilled fear among the Spanish, although they initially maintained some level of organization. The 130 Apache accompanying them, along with other Indian auxiliaries, were acutely aware of the Comanche's formidable reputation and were not inclined to engage in such a confrontation. Parilla attempted to maintain cohesion within the expedition, but many soldiers deserted as the battle commenced, resulting in a panic-driven retreat with minimal engagement. They abandoned their supplies, including cannons. What was meant to demonstrate strength culminated in a profound humiliation. The Apache's strategy to establish a buffer of Spanish forces against the Comanche had disastrously failed. It soon became evident that the Spanish were also incapable of resisting the Comanche, and the situation would deteriorate further for the Apache. Within a few years, the Comanche had advanced southward, frequently raiding the Spanish borderlands, where settlements were dispersed across arid terrain resembling a highway for the Comanche. They adeptly evaded forts, which were perceived as their only genuine threat. The brutality of this era is vividly depicted by S.C. Nguyen in his work, Empire of the Summer Moon, noting that the Comanche never assaulted an armed fort. They thrived on surprise and prioritized tactical superiority, launching attacks on entire villages, incinerating them, and subjecting their inhabitants to torture and death, leaving young women with their entrails removed and men burned alive. They captured infants and took young boys and girls as prisoners. Subsequently, they utilized the speed of the Spanish Mustangs to escape, leaving the heavily equipped dragoons to pursue them at a slow pace. Any efforts by the Spanish to retaliate were often met with frustration. Similar to the Apache, the Spanish struggled to locate the Comanche. Occasionally, punitive expeditions were dispatched against the Comanche, but some returned empty-handed, while others did not return at all. Whether they fell victim to the Comanche or the unforgiving plains remains uncertain. The Spanish found themselves in need of a new strategy, compelled by the Apache's actions. Following the San Saba incident, the Apache resumed their raids against the Spanish, driven not solely by malice but by necessity, as they had been completely displaced from the plains by the Comanche and were unable to cultivate crops. In 1780, Texas Governor Domingo Cabello wrote from San Antonio, expressing concern that reports of atrocities and disturbances were constant, stating, "We are entirely unprotected, which can only lead to the total destruction and loss of this province." The Spanish began to contemplate a strategy they had never considered before, a war of extermination. They faced attacks from two formidable adversaries simultaneously, both of whom despised each other. The Spanish aimed to exploit this rivalry. Until nearly 1780, their attempts to communicate with the Comanche had largely been unsuccessful, but this changed when an officer named Don Juan Batista de Anza gained some respect. He led an expedition into Comanche, employing mounted tactics similar to those of the Comanche, and successfully ambushed a group they caught off guard near Greenhorn Peak. The Comanche's previous underestimation of the Spanish fighting capabilities contributed to their hubris. Anza continued his successful campaign with further assaults in the following years. After each attack, he would release his captives along with a message. The Comanche had the option for peace and trade whenever they desired. By 1785, although the Comanche had not suffered catastrophic losses, the situation was serious enough for them to seek negotiations. Several groups sent delegates to a meeting in Taos, where Anza skillfully facilitated an agreement for a single representative to speak on their behalf. At the conclusion of the meeting, 3 agreements were reached. 1. The Comanche would cease their attacks on the Spanish. 2. Trade would commence between the Spanish and the Comanche. 3. The Comanche would assist the Spanish in eliminating the Apache. This was a significant triumph for the Spanish, as it not only halted hostilities with the Comanche, but also initiated a campaign against their long-standing adversary in the region. The Comanche were agreeable to this arrangement. A notable instance of the Spanish-Comanche collaboration occurred in January 1790, when Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led a formidable force of Spanish and Comanche warriors against the Lipan Apache in Wichita. Hundreds of Apache warriors were cornered in a canyon west of San Antonio and were decimated. Following this defeat, the Lipan Apache were left with fewer than 1,000 warriors. Like other Apache groups, they abandoned their remaining territories on the outskirts of Comanche and retreated into the mountains permanently. As the dominant tribe in North America, the Comanche solidified their control over the plains, and for a time, the Spanish no longer viewed the Apache as a significant threat to their settlements. The peace between the Spanish and Comanche endured for decades. However, the Apache proved to be resilient. While the Comanche triumphed on the plains, the challenging mountainous terrain diminished the advantage of their horses, allowing the Apache to mount a successful resistance. Ultimately, both the Spanish and Comanche civilizations would face decline before the Apache. However, those narratives will be discussed at a later time. Thank you for viewing the video. I trust that you found it enjoyable and will return to explore additional content on the channel. Should you have any inquiries, feedback, or suggestions for upcoming videos, please do not hesitate to share them. We will endeavor to address all of them.